and good evening. Tonight, the Prime Minister and his ministers claim they want Hamas to be destroyed. They claim that Hamas should have no role in the future governing of Gaza. Yet how can we actually believe them when they continue to demand that Israel stop its fight against the terror group? The terror group that has vowed to attack Israel over and over and over again until it is completely annihilated. The terror group that's vowed to continue to attack Israel, and it's a warning we should believe them on, given they slaughtered 1,200 Jews in cold blood on October 7, shooting them, raping them, and mutilating their bodies. In doing it all with glee, bringing their families back home to celebrate and boast. Yet instead of support Israel's war against this barbaric terror group, and instead of being realistic about it and knowing that war does mean some civilian casualties, that's the reality of every war Australia has been involved in, well, the Albanese government demands that Israel give up its fight against Hamas. Just pack up and go home. Our embarrassment of a Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, used her opening remarks in Senate estimates to call on Israel to stop its military campaign. She demanded an immediate ceasefire. Have a look.
The death and destruction in Rafah is horrific. This human suffering is unacceptable. This cannot continue.
It's a call the Foreign Minister has made before, demanding Israel call off its war against Hamas and instead have what she describes as a humanitarian ceasefire.
Australia shares the grave concerns that I have articulated previously about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Human suffering is widespread and it is unacceptable.
No question, civilian casualties are tragic and every civilian death matters. But Penny Wong doesn't acknowledge that it's Hamas, not Israel, responsible for the civilian deaths. Israeli soldiers begged civilians to evacuate from Gaza, from Rafah. They distributed leaflets in Arabic warning them to leave. Israeli politician Sharri Markson told us just last night that they have evidence that Hamas actually shot some civilians who tried to leave.
Hamas, in many cases, is actually threatening them and blocking as well. I mean, we've seen them in many occasions shooting with snipers people who are trying to flee from the war area.
And the esteemed Richard Kemp told us last week just how the civilian death toll in Gaza actually compares with other wars.
If you compare the 0.8 to 1 ratio that Israel has achieved, if you look at Afghanistan and Iraq, in Afghanistan the ratio was 5 to 1, 5 civilians for every terrorist killed. In Iraq, 3 civilians for every terrorist killed. That's by US forces, a similar level probably from British forces as well, but hugely worse. I mean, those countries did their best to minimise civilian casualties as well. The Israelis have achieved a great deal better than that.
And by the way, Israel claims today that it was Hamas weapons that caused dozens of Palestinian deaths, most likely, they say, and not Israel's own strikes. The Times of Israel reports, and I quote, the Israel Defense Forces said Tuesday that a hidden store of weapons may have been the actual cause of a deadly blaze in southern Gaza's Rafah, and that an airstrike that targeted an adjacent area had used small munitions that would not ignite such a fire on their own. The Times of Israel reports that the military suspects that the munitions or some other combustible substance it was unaware of caused a secondary explosion and a fire to spread in a complex housing displaced Gazans in Rafah. They say it killed dozens of Palestinian civilians following an airstrike targeting 2 top Hamas terrorists in the area. So Israel also said that before their strike on a Hamas compound, they carried out steps to make sure that there were no women or children in the Hamas compound. But Penny Wong ignores all of this, ignores the reality of war, the horrible reality of war, and ignores the necessity of eliminating Hamas and the difficulties that Israel faces in doing it. But do it they must. Given Penny Wong's comments today, it is surprising that Anthony Albanese claims to be a friend of Israel. He still claims. In an interview with former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg in the documentary last night, we saw that Albanese claimed that he supports the state of Israel.
And what we're seeing isn't intellectual engagement or discourse. What we're seeing is a promotion of simplistic slogans and, in some cases, a promotion of hate. Now, I support the state of Israel. I also support a two-state solution.
Well, Labor can't have it both ways when it comes to their so-called support for the state of Israel. Either Australia stands by its decision that recognises that Hamas must be removed from power, or it supports a ceasefire. It can't support both. How does Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese actually want Hamas to be removed from governing in Gaza? Fairy dust? Penny Wong's comments remind us that Labor is a fair-weather friend of Israel, at least the federal government, not Chris Minns in New South Wales. Federal Labor is a fair-weather friend of Israel. And they claim to condemn anti-Semitism, and yet their comments contribute to it. And anti-Semitism is continuing to explode in our streets and in our schools, and of course, at our prestigious universities, where students talk about chasing Zionists off campus and they shout, "Intifada revolution."
Thank you. You got it.
Now, you think Sydney University's Vice-Chancellor Mark Scott would be trying to deal with those clearly anti-Semitic chants, but instead the former ABC boss is now rewarding these protesters for their hate by going so far as to include them in the university's policies, inviting them to review their defence and security research ties, and this means that any ties with Israel could be cut. This is the same university that claimed chants of intifada were not hate speech. Now, the Coalition's Sarah Henderson spoke with my colleague James McPherson just a short while ago, and she condemned this in no uncertain terms. This is a major problem of university leadership and political leadership. You have to ask where the Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, is on this, because it does amount to an effective boycott of Israel by the University of Sydney. Now, in Josh Frydenberg's documentary last night, the former PM John Howard makes this point about Labor's responsibility for the crisis that we're in.
I believe that if, from the beginning, the horrible events, the 7th of October, had been denounced in unequivocal terms, no ifs, buts, maybes, no equivalents, none of that. From the very beginning, you would not have had quite these outbreaks.
What would you give to have John Howard or even Julia Gillard or any other leader who's able to find the courage and strength to stand up to those filled with hate as our Prime Minister right now, instead of the leaders that we do have who are capitulating to the terrorists and allowing anti-Semitism to fester?